The dust rose in thin, bitter clouds around my boots as they herded us into the open ground. 23 of us in all. Some still bleeding from the raid on the water station 6 weeks earlier. Others simply hollow-eyed from the long march south. The wooden platforms above us creaked under the weight of the orcs who had come to watch. They laughed and called out numbers, pointing at each captive in turn, laying wagers on who would last the longest once the horn sounded. I kept my gaze on the tree line. The forest waited, thick and wrong. Even from here I could see the faint green glow of the poison thorns that grew in dense clusters along the game trails. I had watched what those thorns did to flesh. She dropped from the highest platform without warning. The orc woman landed in a crouch that sent a small shock through the packed earth. She straightened slowly. Tall, broad through the shoulders, skin the color of wet river stone, black hair braided tight against her skull. Scars crossed one cheek and disappeared beneath the iron plates on her shoulder. She carried no bow, only a long knife at her hip and another strapped to her thigh. When she walked toward me, the other orcs above fell quiet for a moment, as if they knew this was the part they had paid to see. She stopped 3 paces away, close enough that I could smell the iron on her armor and the sharp resin scent of the forest that clung to her braids. "Look at this one," she called upward, her voice carrying easily across the arena. "Hair already turning to frost, belly gone soft from years of sitting by the fire. This human will drop before I even work up a sweat." Laughter rolled down from the platforms like stones. She tilted her head, studying me the way a hunter studies a track that does not quite make sense. "You should run, human," she said. The smile that followed showed too many teeth. "Run fast, when the horn sounds. I like to hear my prey breathing hard before I take them." I looked at her, then I looked past her, at the dark mouth of the forest. "No," I said, "I will walk." Her brow drew down. "I will walk," I told her, "until you fall first." The laughter above us cut off for one long heartbeat. Then it returned, louder, edged with something sharper than amusement. I had not said it to make them believe me. I said it because I had been watching since they first pushed us into this place. When the first horn had sounded earlier, a boy named Marek had broken and sprinted straight into the trees. His shoulder brushed a thick stand of the glowing green thorns. He managed 5 more steps before his legs simply stopped obeying him. He went down hard, eyes still open, chest still rising and falling in shallow jerks. By the time the orcs dragged him back by one ankle, those jerks had already stopped. I had seen enough to understand the shape of this hunt. While the others pressed together and whispered, I tore long strips from the bottom of my shirt. I wrapped them tight around my ankles and calves, then around my wrists and the palms of my hands. The cloth would not stop the thorns, but it might slow the poison long enough for me to cut it away. I found a piece of rusted iron half buried near the fence line and worked one edge against a flat stone until it could cut. I turned my coat inside out, used the lining to shape a crude water skin, and filled it from a water skin the orcs had left near the gate. One of the other captives, a woman with gray streaking her hair, watched me with wide, frightened eyes. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Preparing to live," I answered. She did not ask anything else. I had spent 45 years as Derek Holt, walking the border villages with a hammer and a bag of nails, repairing water wheels after every flood and mending bridges after every storm. I was not fast. I was not strong in the way warriors measured strength. But I knew how to keep moving when my body wanted to stop. I knew how to read the land instead of fighting it. And I knew that panic burned through strength faster than any blade. When the final horn blew, most of them ran. I walked. The forest took me in without ceremony. The ground beneath the first line of trees was soft with old needles and the faint sweet rot of things that had fallen and not been eaten. I chose the narrow game trails the deer used because deer did not choose paths that led to death. I kept the wind in my face so my scent would not drift back toward whoever followed. Every step I placed heel first, then rolled slowly to the ball of my foot. The motion was quiet. It was also sustainable. I had walked 30 miles in a single day more than once when the spring floods came and the villages needed their wheels turning again. No one had cheered for that work. It had simply needed doing. Behind me, somewhere in the trees, I heard the first crash of heavier feet. She was coming. Fast at first. The sound of branches snapping and armor brushing bark told me she expected this to end quickly. I did not change my pace. I kept the same measured stride, the same careful placement of each foot. When I reached a narrow stream, I stopped only long enough to drink and refill the skin I had made. Then I kept walking. The light changed as the afternoon wore on. The green glow of the poison thorns grew brighter in the deeper shade. I gave them a wide berth. Twice I heard the short, panicked cries of other captives who had not been so careful. Each time the sound faded quickly. I did not look back. She was still behind me. I could feel it in the way the birds had stopped singing in certain patches of the canopy. She moved well for someone so large, but the forest was not built for sudden bursts of speed. It punished haste. Every time she had to cut through a thick stand of thorns or climb over a fallen log, she lost a little more of the advantage her strength had given her at the start. By the time the light began to fail, the sound of her pursuit had grown farther away. I found a hollow beneath the roots of an old pine and sat with my back against the trunk. I did not sleep. I ate nothing. I simply rested my legs and listened to the forest settle into night. Somewhere to the east, an animal I could not name called once, low and rough. I stayed still until the call faded. When the moon rose high enough to cast thin shadows, I stood and began walking again. I did not know how long she would keep coming. I only knew that I would not stop first. And far behind me, though I could no longer hear her, the orc woman named Vera Bloodthorn was still following. The forest did not grow quieter as the light failed. It simply changed its voice. The daybirds went still, and the night ones began their work. I kept the same pace I had held since the horn sounded, heel to toe, steady, letting the ground tell me where to place each foot. I had walked like this through spring floods when the river rose and the villages needed their wheels turning before the fields drowned. No one had called that work heroic. It had only needed doing. I kept the wind in my face. Every so often I would pause, wet a finger, and lift it to feel the air. When the wind shifted, I adjusted my direction so my scent would not drift back along the path I had taken. The game trails helped. Deer and the smaller, quick-footed creatures knew which ways led to water and which led to death. I followed their choices. Behind me, the sound of pursuit had grown distant, but not gone. She moved well for someone so large, yet the forest punished speed. Every thick stand of the glowing green thorns forced her to stop and cut. Every fallen log she had to climb over cost her time. I heard the sharp crack of branches and the low, frustrated sounds she made when the undergrowth resisted her. She was still confident. She still believed this would end soon. I reached a narrow stream just before full dark. The water ran cold and fast over smooth stones. I knelt, drank slowly, then refilled the skin I had made from my coat lining. The cold helped clear my head. I crossed carefully, stepping from stone to stone rather than wading and soaking my boots. Wet feet would slow me later. On the far bank, I turned and looked back once. The trees on the other side were already deep in shadow. She was not yet in sight. I walked through the night. The cold came down hard after moonrise. My breath showed white. The wrapped cloth around my ankles and wrists grew damp with dew and sweat. I did not stop to rest beyond a few minutes at a time. I ate nothing. Sleep was not an option. If I slept, she would close the distance while I lay still. So I kept moving, letting the rhythm of my steps keep the stiffness from settling too deep into my legs and back. Near the middle of the night, I heard a low, rough call from the darkness to my left. Something large moved between the trees. I saw the shape of it in the moonlight. 6 legs, thick gray fur, shoulders higher than my own. It had caught my scent. I stopped walking. I picked up a fallen branch as thick as my wrist and struck the nearest tree trunk hard 3 times. The sound cracked through the quiet. Then I straightened to my full height, filled my chest, and shouted back at it with everything left in my lungs. The beast paused. It made a sound low in its throat, testing. I struck the tree again and shouted once more. After a long moment it turned and moved away into the deeper dark. I waited until the sound of its passage faded, then I began walking again. My hands were shaking. I let them shake. Fear was not the enemy. Stopping was. By the time the sky began to pale, my legs had grown heavy and the wrapped cloth on my right ankle had started to fray where a thorn had caught it. I felt the sting, but did not stop to look. I would deal with it when I could no longer keep moving. She was closer now. I could tell by the way the birds went silent in patches ahead of me and then resumed behind. She had narrowed the gap during the night, but not enough. The forest still cost her more than it cost me. Her body was built for short, violent effort. Mine had spent 45 years learning how to keep working long after the first strength was gone. Near mid-morning, I reached a wider river. The water ran fast and cold between high banks. On the far side, the trees thinned into open ground before rising again into another stretch of forest. I studied the current for several minutes. Then I found a fallen log long enough to bear my weight and dragged it to the edge. I tied my small bundle of tools and the water skin to it with strips of cloth, then pushed the log into the water and held on. The river took me. The cold bit deep. The current slammed me against rocks more than once, tearing the skin on my left shin and sending a bright flare of pain up my leg. I kept my grip on the log and kicked toward the opposite bank at an angle, letting the flow do most of the work. When I finally dragged myself onto the far shore, my boots were full of water and my hands were numb. I did not allow myself more than a minute to catch my breath. I emptied the boots as best I could, retied the cloth wraps tighter over the new wound, and kept walking. From the opposite bank I heard her. She had reached the place where I entered the water. Her voice carried across the rush of the current a single harsh sound of frustration. She paced along the edge, looking for a place to cross. There was none nearby that would not sweep even an orc of her size downstream. She would have to travel upriver, searching for a fallen tree or a shallower ford. That would cost her hours. I had taken half a day from her. I did not smile. There was nothing to smile about. My leg was bleeding through the cloth and the cold had settled into my bones, but I was still moving and she was not. That was enough. I turned my back to the river and walked into the next stretch of forest. The game trails here were narrower, the canopy thicker. I chose my path with care, always keeping the wind in my face, always placing each foot with the same deliberate roll from heel to toe. Behind me, the sound of the river slowly faded. She would come. She would find a way across. But I had already changed the shape of the hunt. She was no longer the one deciding how this would end. I was. The second day began with the sound of her moving closer. She was no longer trying to be quiet. Anger had stripped away the last of her patience. I heard branches breaking in long, impatient strokes, and the low, rough sound of her breathing as she pushed through the undergrowth. She had spent the night cold and hungry, and the forest had offered her no comfort. Now she hunted with the single-minded fury of someone who had been made to feel foolish. I used that. I led her toward a thick stand of wild cane that grew in a low, wet hollow. The stalks were dense and springy, taller than a man, with narrow spaces between them that small animals had worn into twisting tunnels. I slipped between the stems easily, moving on hands and knees when I had to, the wrapped cloth on my palms protecting me from the rough edges. Behind me, I heard her curse as she tried to force her larger frame through the same narrow gaps. She hacked at the cane with her knife, but every cut only made the remaining stalks close in tighter. She was strong, but strength meant little when the forest itself resisted. I kept moving until I found a small clearing no wider than my arms could reach. Then I waited. She broke through the last wall of cane with a final, furious shove. For one heartbeat she stood there, breathing hard, her knife raised. Her eyes found me immediately. There was no triumph in them now, only a hard, bright anger. I did not run. She lunged. I dropped backward at the last moment, letting my body fall flat against the damp earth. Her blade whispered past my face, close enough that I felt the wind of it. As she overbalanced, I drove my heel hard into the side of her left knee. There was a wet, cracking sound. She made a short, shocked noise and went down on that leg, her weight twisting awkwardly. For a moment, she stayed on one knee, knife still in her hand, staring at me with something close to disbelief. I could have ended it then. The rusted shard of iron I had sharpened was in my hand. One quick thrust to the throat while she was off balance and the hunt would be over. She knew it. I saw the knowledge move across her face. I stood up instead. I brushed the dirt from my coat, turned, and walked away through the cane. She shouted after me, her voice raw. "Coward, come back, kill me or let me kill you." I did not turn. I did not answer. The sound of her voice followed me for a little while, then faded as the cane closed behind me. I kept walking at the same steady pace, letting the forest swallow the noise. That was when I began to lead her in truth. I stopped trying to hide my trail. I left clear footprints in soft patches of earth. I placed small stones in the shape of arrows pointing in the direction I wanted her to follow. I broke branches at shoulder height so she would see the fresh breaks. I wanted her to know I was choosing the path. I wanted her to understand that she was no longer the hunter deciding how this would end. By midday, the heat had grown thick and wet. She was suffering. I could hear it in the way her steps had lost their earlier rhythm. Orcs were built for sudden violence and short, brutal effort. They were not built for hours of slow pursuit through heavy air and clinging undergrowth. She was breathing through her mouth now. Her armor creaked with every step. The anger that had driven her earlier was turning into something heavier. I felt the same weight in my own body. My right shin had swollen around the cut from the river. The wrapped cloth on my ankle was stiff with dried blood and dirt. My back ached with a deep, steady throb that never quite left. But I had spent 45 years working through pain that did not announce itself with drama. I knew how to keep moving when movement itself was the only victory left. When the light began to fail again, I found a place where two large roots formed a shallow hollow beneath an old tree. I sat with my back against the trunk and listened to the forest settle. Somewhere not far behind me, she had stopped moving. I imagined her making camp, trying to rest on an empty stomach with an injured knee. I did not sleep. I ate nothing. I simply waited for the moon to rise high enough to cast clear shadows. Then I turned around. I followed my own trail back through the dark. It took time. I moved with the same care I had used all along, placing each foot with purpose. When I finally saw the faint glow of her small fire through the trees, I stopped and studied the clearing for a long time. She had made a poor camp. The fire was small, more smoke than flame. She sat with her back against a tree, her injured leg stretched out in front of her. One hand rested on the hilt of her knife, even in half-sleep. Her water skin lay beside her. The pouch that held her food hung from a low branch. I waited until her breathing had settled into the deeper rhythm of true sleep. Then I stepped into the clearing. I moved slowly. Every sound I made was deliberate and quiet. I picked up the water skin first. It was nearly empty. I poured what remained into my own skin, then cut the bottom from hers with the edge of my iron shard so that it would hold nothing. Next, I turned to the food pouch. I did not take the food. I simply cut the strap almost through, leaving only a few threads holding it together. When she ran again, it would tear free and spill. Last, I stepped close to where she slept. Her face in the low firelight looked younger than it had on the killing ground. The hard lines around her mouth had softened in sleep. One long braid had fallen across her shoulder. I took the sharpened iron and cut through the braid just above the leather tie that bound it. The severed piece came away in my hand, heavy and still warm from her body. She did not wake. I stood over her for a moment longer. I could have driven the iron into her throat. I could have ended the hunt and the threat she represented to every captive who had not been as careful as I was. The thought was there, clear and simple. I put the iron shard away. Before I left the clearing, I spoke, barely louder than the crack of the small fire. "Not tonight." She did not stir. I turned and walked back into the dark, following a new path that would take me away from the one she would expect. Behind me, the fire burned low, and the orc woman named Vera slept on, unaware that the prey she had been sent to kill had stood above her and chosen, once again, to let her live. When she woke in the morning, she would find the empty water skin, the ruined food pouch, and the missing braid. She would understand that I had been close enough to touch her, close enough to end her, and that I had walked away instead. That knowledge would change the shape of the hunt more than any blade could. The third day rose gray and cold. I had walked through most of the night, turning back only once to leave Vera the signs she needed. Now the land began to rise beneath my feet. The trees thinned. The ground grew harder, scattered with loose stone. Ahead, the forest gave way to a long, bare slope that climbed toward the cliffs of Varric. I had chosen this place on the second day when I first understood how the hunt would end. Varric was not a refuge. It was a finishing line. 200 feet of broken rock, steep enough to kill a careless man with almost no water and even less cover. A place that rewarded patience over speed. I had no strength left for clever tricks, only the one thing I had always possessed. I began to climb. Each handhold required thought. Each push upward cost more than it should. My right leg had swollen badly around the cut from the river. The cloth I had wrapped around it was stiff with dried blood and dirt, and every time I shifted my weight, the wound pulled open again. My palms were raw where the cloth had worn through. My back felt as though someone had driven nails between the shoulder blades and left them there. I did not rush. I found one small ledge, tested it, moved my weight onto it, then reached for the next. One hold, one breath, one pull, that was all the world contained. Below me, somewhere on the slope, I heard her. She was still coming. I could hear the scrape of her boots against stone and the occasional sharp sound when her injured knee struck a rock. She had no water left. I had taken it. Her food pouch had torn free during the night and spilled what remained. She had been forced to choose between chasing me and stopping to gather what she could. She had chosen to chase. I kept climbing. The sun climbed with me. By the time I reached the last stretch of cliff, the light had turned white and harsh. My arms shook when I pulled myself over the final ledge. I lay on my back for a long moment, staring at the empty sky, listening to the sound of my own breathing. It was not a victory. It was only that I had not stopped. After a while, I forced myself to sit up, then to stand. My legs did not want to hold me. I made them. She reached the top some time later. I heard her first. The sound of someone dragging themselves over stone. Then her hands appeared at the edge of the cliff, followed by her head. Her braids were filthy. Her face was streaked with dust and sweat. She pulled herself onto the flat rock and stayed there on her stomach, breathing in short, shallow pulls. The knife was still in her hand, but she could not lift it. Her injured leg dragged behind her, useless. She tried once to push herself upright and failed. The second time she managed to get to her knees, then collapsed onto her side. She lay at my feet. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind moved across the bare stone, cold and steady. Far below, the forest looked small and distant, like something that belonged to another life. When she finally found her voice, it was rough and thin. "Why, did you not run?" I sat down on a flat rock across from her. The distance between us was only a few paces, but it felt wider than the river I had crossed. "Because you were made to run fast," I said, "and I was made to keep walking." She turned her head enough to look at me. Her yellow eyes were clouded with pain and exhaustion. There was no anger left in them, only something raw and uncertain. I continued. "My people once hunted by walking, not with spears or horses. We followed the animal across open ground, under the sun for as long as it took. We did not need to be faster. We only needed to be the last ones still moving when the animal could move no more. That is what I did to you." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, something had changed in her face. The last of the certainty she had carried on the killing ground was gone. I reached into my coat and drew out the small iron shard I had carried since the beginning. She saw it. She did not flinch. She simply watched as I leaned forward and cut a single braid from her hair, just above the leather tie that held it. The braid came away heavy in my hand. I set it on the rock between us, then I took the water skin I had refilled at the last stream and placed it beside her. "Drink," I said. "You still have a long way to crawl back to your people." She stared at the skin, then at the braid, then at me. For the first time since I had seen her drop from the platform, there was no contempt in her eyes, only fear, not the fear of death, the fear of having been understood completely by someone she had been taught to despise. I stood. My legs protested, but they held. I turned my back on her and walked toward the far side of the plateau where the slope began its long descent. I did not look back. There was nothing left to see on that high, empty rock. Halfway down the far slope, I stopped. Below me, spread along the lower trail, stood the warriors of the Blackthorn clan. They had been there for some time. I could see it in the way they held themselves, silent and unmoving. At their head was an older orc with hair gone to iron gray. When he saw me, he lowered his head. One by one, the others did the same. No one spoke. No one reached for a weapon. I continued down the slope, past them, into the trees. They did not follow. They did not call out. They simply remained where they were, heads bowed, while the wind moved across the high stone behind them. The descent from the high stone took what little strength I had left. Each step sent a fresh line of fire up my right leg, and the wound from the river had opened again, soaking through the cloth I had wrapped around it. By the time the trees closed around me, I was moving more by memory than by will. The sun had already dropped behind the western ridges when I heard voices ahead. They were human voices. 3 of the captives who had escaped the killing ground found me near a dry stream bed. Regina was among them, along with a man named Upton and a younger woman whose name I never learned. They had followed the same slow logic I had tried to teach them before the horn sounded. They had not run in panic. They had walked hidden and waited. When they saw me, they did not cheer. They simply took my arms over their shoulders and helped me the last distance to the camp at Northwell. I remember little of the next days. The fever took me hard. For 7 nights, I drifted between the camp and somewhere darker, where the green thorns whispered and the river kept slamming me against stone. When the fever finally broke, I woke to the sound of rain on canvas and the smell of wood smoke. My leg had been cleaned and bound properly. Someone had left a bowl of thin broth beside the cot. Word of what had happened on the high stone had already reached the camp. The orcs had not pursued the remaining captives. They had withdrawn from the southern forest entirely. No one knew why at first. Then the stories began to change. The Blackthorn warriors had seen their best hunter brought to her knees by a middle-aged man with no weapon and no speed. They had seen him walk away from the kill. They had seen their own elder bow his head to that same man. I did not speak of it. There was nothing to say that the silence had not already said. Vera came to the camp 3 weeks later. She arrived alone, on foot, with no weapons and no armor. Her hair had been cut short above the place where I had taken the braid. The missing length marked her in a way no scar ever could. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and waited until the guards lowered their spears. Then she walked straight to the long tent where I was still recovering. She stood at the foot of the cot and looked at me for a long moment. The hardness I had seen on the killing ground was gone. What remained was something quieter and more difficult. "I have come to return the debt," she said. I studied her face. The cut on her cheek had healed into a thin white line. The knee I had broken still carried a slight stiffness when she shifted her weight. "There is no debt," I answered. She did not argue. She simply nodded once, turned, and left the tent. She did not leave the area. For the first month, she kept to the edge of the forest, sleeping in the open and hunting only what she needed. The people of Northwell watched her with fear that slowly turned to uneasy tolerance. She never asked for shelter. She never asked for forgiveness. Instead, she began to leave small gifts at the boundary stones, bundles of feverwort for the sick, marked trails showing where the poison thorns grew thickest, and once, a warning carved into a tree that a pack of 6-legged beasts had moved into the lower valley. When 2 children wandered too far and became lost in the thorn thickets, it was Vera who found them and carried them back. She did not wait for thanks. She simply set them down at the edge of the camp and disappeared again into the trees. I began to walk the boundary each morning once my leg could bear weight. She would appear, never close, never speaking first. After several weeks, I stopped one morning and waited. She came out of the shadow of the trees and stood 10 paces away. "You are healing," she said. "So are you." She touched the place where her braid had been. "I was taught that humans were prey, weak, easy to break. My clan still believes it. I no longer know what to believe." I considered my answer for a long time. "My people have their own stories," I said at last. "We tell ourselves that orcs are nothing but rage and hunger. Both stories are easier than the truth." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. After that, we walked together sometimes, not speaking much, simply moving through the forest at the same measured pace. She showed me the hidden game trails. I showed her how to read the weather in the way the leaves turned their undersides to the wind. We began to share meals beside small fires when the nights grew cold. The silences between us grew longer and less heavy. Years passed in that slow way. Vera returned to her clan only once to speak against the old hunting custom. She was challenged. She was called weak. She was told that mercy was the first step toward extinction. She answered each challenge on the open ground, unarmed, and refused to strike back even when blood ran down her face. In the end, the elders voted to end the practice of taking humans for sport. not because they had changed their hearts, but because they had seen what happened when one of their own was broken by patience instead of force. She came back to Northwell with new scars and a quieter voice. We did not speak of marriage for a long time. The past she carried was too heavy, and the people of the camp still watched her with careful eyes. But the years kept moving, and the fear slowly gave way to something else. One spring evening, when the feverwort bloomed along the stream, she asked if I would walk with her to the high stone one last time. We stood where I had placed the water skin at her feet years before. The wind moved across the bare rock the way it always had. I once told you to run, she said. I remember. You did not run. No. She looked out over the forest that had once been a killing ground. I thought strength was the first blow, the fastest strike, the loudest voice. You taught me. It was the step that still comes after the body wants to stop. I reached out and took her hand. The scars on her knuckles were rough against my palm. I thought orcs were only the thing that came out of the dark, I said. You taught me that even the darkest places can choose to become something else. We were married in the late summer, in the open ground between the human camp and the forest edge. Both peoples came, though neither side was entirely comfortable. She spoke first, her voice carrying across the clearing without effort. I once told this man to run. He did not run. He walked until I could walk no farther. He showed me that the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to become the story others have written for them. When it was my turn, I looked at her, at the short hair and the old scars and the eyes that no longer carried contempt. I once saw her as the thing that hunted me. She became the one who walked beside me instead. No one can erase what has already been done, but a person can walk far enough that the past no longer decides the next step. After the ceremony, we returned to the small house I had built at the edge of Northwell. That night, while the last guest still talked quietly around the fires, she asked me the question she had carried since the high stone. If I had woken that night in the forest when you stood over me with the iron in your hand, would you have used it? I thought about the answer for a long time. I do not know, I said honestly. I only know that I chose not to. And every step since then has been the same choice. She was quiet for a while. Then she rested her head against my shoulder, the way she sometimes did when the old dreams came. On the killing ground, I told you to run, she said softly. I looked out at the dark line of trees that no longer held death for either of us. I did not run, I answered. I only began to walk. And that was enough to change everything.